99.9 Punk World Radio FM, Elite Wrestle Talk. This is episode 36, and we're joined by a wrestling veteran and legend. This guy has not only wrestled in Japan, NWA, WWF, WCW, he is also an NCAA Olympic-style mat wrestler as well. This guy has honestly done it all. We got Maxx Payne, also known as Man Mountain Rock, right here live on the radio. Max, how you doing tonight, dude?
Man, I am just fantastic. So glad to be with you, DJ.
Oh man, so glad to be here with you as well. I saw your interviews as well. You did recently with Jack Kilby of Cheap Heat. Gotta say, an amazing conversation. I know Jack, he's probably out there watching, so I know I can't put on a great interview like Jack, but I will try my best here tonight.
Oh, I think you'll do fine, my friend. I think you'll do fine.
But I do know you're a very busy individual, Max, so I'm going to dive right into this. But I want to take you back to the early 80s, where you were actually an All-American, and you placed fifth in the NCAA competition. I was wondering if you can actually tell us a bit more about your NCAA days. And of course, was it a difficult transition going from Olympic-style mat wrestling to your typical televised professional wrestling that we watch on TV?
You know, not only was it difficult, I actually have someplace, I have the article from the Iowa State newspaper because, of course, they asked me after the tournament, you know, was I going to follow in Chris Taylor's footsteps now and, you know, go into professional wrestling, as well as my coach had asked me that as well. And at that time, I was still really adamantly against professional wrestling because, you know, when you're an NCAA, when you're a collegiate wrestler, you spend all your time, you know, convincing people that that's not the wrestling you watch on television, you know, because people would say, "Oh yeah, I watch you on television." All that, and I'd go, "No, you don't. No, you don't. You've never seen me wrestle on television." It was, you know, it was insulting. And so the transition, at first I thought, you know, when I first was introduced to the wrestling business and I met Red Bastien the first time and I sat down with him and I was actually exposed to the reality of what professional wrestling was. It was actually quite easy because that's a hard proposition. Wrestling is it's a tough ass sport. So there was that. I know this is going to sound kind of crazy, but there was actually relief that came from not having to worry whether you were going out there in a spontaneous athletic competition to see who was the better athlete. You were actually going out there to 100% entertain a crowd. And that was so easy for me to embrace that I actually couldn't wait to shun those robes, so to speak. I mean, so at first, like I said, I was vehemently against it. But once I saw the freedom that came from being a professional wrestler, I embraced it immediately and I never looked back.
And I have to say as well, it definitely takes one tough SOB to be able to do, you know, mat wrestling and then going into that. Like you literally had the opportunity to experience both sides of the wrestling business because a lot of people don't realize, I mean, a lot of that wrestling in NCAA, my apologies, definitely does carry over to places like WCW and WWE. I mean, for instance, Kurt Angle, Brock Lesnar were a part of the NCAA, and they made their mark within the professional wrestling business as well. So you got to see both sides of the business.
Yeah, I actually wrestled during the time. I never wrestled Rob Ricksteiner and Scott. Scott was 185 pounds. He wasn't a heavyweight, but Rob, his brother, was. Most people don't realize that the Rick Steiner brothers' names is actually Rick Steiner. So Rob is his full name, Rob Ricksteiner, and Rick Steiner was their full last name, and then he just broke the name down to Rick Steiner, and so he wrestled for the University of Michigan. So did Scott. So it's funny because that's the part of amateur wrestling. I was lucky enough too. I had a very successful JUCO career too, and it's the part of professional wrestling that's amazing is, and then add to it all of that. I got to say, one of my favorite parts of my mat wrestling experiences was learning submission wrestling from this guy named Fujiwara in the New Japan Pro Wrestling Dojo. So I got to be around, then I got to be around Doc. Actually, Dr. Death Steve Williams, he actually was the guy that the University of Oklahoma used to recruit me when I went to Norman, and I have some amazing recruiting stories with the University of Oklahoma wrestling team. I met the Schultz brothers and Andre Metzger and Doc, and we partied, and just I had some great times. But there's something really magical. I was involved in amateur wrestling from the time I was very, very young. And I was really, really fortunate to be in a wrestling movie when I was 16 years old. I was in a wrestling movie. In fact, the predecessor to one of the greatest wrestling movies ever made, which was Vision Quest, in my opinion. I was in a movie called Takedown in 1978. And so I was so lucky to be around amateur wrestling really from the beginning of my athletic career. So it was really ingrained deep in me.
And by the sounds of it as well, Takedown actually sparked this extraordinary wrestling career as well. Because I do know Takedown, you did that at a very, very young age. So was
Right.
being a part of that movie and actually seeing the movie cinematic experience of professional wrestling, did that kind of lead you into wanting more of wrestling?
Oh, Takedown. It's funny because Takedown actually motivated me to want a career in television and film. So Takedown sparked the entertainment side of me. And that's I used the voice in my head from Takedown. That was the voice in my head that drove my heels to want to want to go back to school. And I knew what would get me through school was my talent as an amateur wrestler. So I used, because even though I dropped out of high school, Takedown changed my life. Just I'm like a typical, even though Takedown wasn't a huge success in terms of motion picture success, Takedown forever changed my life in a way that was such at a core level that it absolutely, even to this day, is the voice in my head that drives my heels to want to do entertainment and want to come and be on your show. I mean, this is the part that Takedown played in my life. And I was so lucky because Oklahoma State University had started to recruit me when I was a junior in high school. Before Takedown, actually, my coach in high school was his name was Daryl Henry, and he was a world famous referee. He went all over the world to ref matches, and so he knew everybody. He knew every coach, and he'd already started talking to a guy named Tommy Chesborough at Oklahoma State University. And even after I dropped out of school because of Takedown, in the year that Takedown was filmed, I dropped out of high school, released Takedown, and had my first child uh, on December 21st of that year in 1978. So 1978 was a big year for me. I mean, a really big year. And because of Takedown, I decided I worked construction for my senior, which would have been my senior year in high school. And because of that, I I worked construction and hated working construction, hated that life for me because I had this overwhelming desire to be in the film industry. And that was the voice in my head again that drove my heels to go back to school and get a GED and graduate from high school and eventually contact Tommy Chesborough, who had contacted me and told me if I ever graduated from high school to give him a call. He would be very interested in bringing me to Iowa State or to Oklahoma State and wrestling there. And as soon as I got my graduation equivalency diploma, I called him on the phone, and then the rest of it is history. He helped me get into North Idaho College, and I went there and was a two-time All-American and national champion on a national championship team there, and then ended up giving me the ability to go to an NCAA school like Iowa State.
And speaking of history, you were actually a part of an infamous steel cage match. Maybe not on television, but you were one of the individuals that helped put it together. On
I was,
March 1986 at the World Wrestling Federation, you were a crew member that helped put together the steel cage for the Hulk Hogan versus King Kong Bundy WrestleMania 2 steel cage match. I was wondering, what's the story actually behind this opportunity? And what was it like just putting together the cage for the second ever WrestleMania?
well, that was, that was that moment where, you know, again, I look back at my life and how I ended up in professional wrestling and the guy that broke me in, and I'm so lucky. I really am. I was so blessed and so fortunate to have met the people that I met along the way that ended up, getting me there. So it's a very long story, and I won't tell you all of the story of how I got to that, to the point where I was working for the WWF. But there was the guy that broke me in the business is a guy named Red Bastine, and I met him very coincidentally at a boxing match that I was working as a security guard at on Sunset Strip in Los Angeles at the Palladium, which there was a boxing match, Tate, Tillman, and Gonzalez, and I met Red there. And Red immediately put me to work and started training me. And I broke in at the at the bottom, brother. I mean, I started building the ring and carrying jackets for the WWF. And Red loved me because pro wrestling loved shooters. They loved amateur wrestling guys because it like you were talking about, it lends credibility to a sport that you know has none, so to speak, when it comes to that. Everybody knows wrestling's fixed, and so, and wrestling still engaged heavily in kayfabe then, and so Red, any time that the pro wrestling world can attract an amateur wrestler, they love it because, like I said, it gives them credibility that they constantly long for. So Red loved me from the beginning. The fact that I was a three-time All-American only added, and then so to talk about building the cage, I have to tell a story that precedes that. One of the first things you learn in the pro wrestling business is, one of the first lessons that Red taught me was, whenever you come to this building, you always bring your gear. So the first thing I did was buy a pair of boots from Bill Ash at the B Bar A. If anybody who knows the wrestling business from that long ago, there was a guy in Paris, Arkansas named Bill Ash, and I don't even know if he's still there because now things have changed so much, but Bill was like the only guy in the world that made wrestling boots, right? So I bought my first pair of wrestling boots from Bill Ash. And I had this bag that my nephew and I had gone to Mexico and bought just for putting my gear in. It was a really cool leather bag I'd bought in Tijuana. And so I had my bag with gear that every day, whenever I went to build the ring, I always threw that, in my car. And this particular day, Red comes back in the dressing room and he says, "Hey, Max," he said, "Did you bring your gear with you today, brother?" And I said, "Well, yeah, of course, Red." He goes, "I want you to put it on right now." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Just put it on." I said, "Okay." So I put the gear on, and he says, "There's a guy. We were in Los Angeles actually this evening, and he says there's a guy out here from San Diego who plays for the Chargers, and he thinks he wants to be a wrestler now after watching the first WrestleMania. And I've got a friend back here by the name of Chief Jay Strongbow, and he wants you to go out and stretch this prick." And I said, "Well, okay." And so we're walking out to the ring, and Red looks at me, grabs me, turns me to his face, and he goes, "I want you to remember something." He said, "This son of a bitch has never had a pair of boots on, and he's never had any wrestling gear on in his life. He goes, you go out there and you school this son of a bitch. Make him cry." I said, "Okay, Red." So I go out, and here's Jay Strongbow with this guy. This guy was no tiny dude, man. He was a big boy. He was probably 6'7", 300 pounds. I think he was a defensive lineman or a hell of a big linebacker for San Diego. And Jay pulls me, and he goes, "Look, I've never met you before." He goes, "But you school this son of a bitch, all right?" I said, "Okay." So I get in the ring with this guy, and the first thing he does when I tie up with him, I could tell he didn't know shit about wrestling, because I go to tie up with him, and the first thing he does is whisper in my ear is, "Please don't hurt me. I don't know shit about wrestling." Needless to say that those words fell on deaf ears, and I just took him down and spanked him and just, put a wrestling clinic on. And this guy, I had him screaming a few times. And when we got done, this guy left. Jay went right to Red, and he said, "Red, goddammit, I want this guy into business right now. I'm calling Vince on the phone." And Red, God bless him. God bless him. Red said, "No, you're not, Jay. I got him booked in Japan. You can't have him. Let him go. Let him not be green in Japan. Let him go over there and let the Japanese teach him, but you can't have him yet." And Jay goes, "Okay, but goddammit, as soon as he gets back, I want this kid in my..." Red said, yeah, okay. So that's when I really got to know the back echelon of the WWF. And then Andre came to town, and Red took care of Andre. I went out with Red and Andre to dinner and just sat in the background, didn't say shit. And in fact, if I'm not mistaken, I think he set me down at a table next to him. I don't even think I sat at the same table as Red and Andre that day. But I met Andre, and Andre was incredibly cordial and nice to me. And this was in prep, the roll up to WrestleMania. And Red came to me one day and he said, "Listen, I got a task for you. I got somebody you need to meet." And it was Pat Patterson. And Pat came to me, and he said, "We need this ring built. We need this cage built in 2 minutes. Red says you're the guy to do it." And I said, "Well, I don't even know all the details yet, but I will make it happen, sir." And so Red had this old cage. It was the preferred cage of all the boys, I found out later. It was literally a 4-piece cage and it was made of solid steel pipe. And it had 4 sections, and one of the sections had a door in it, obviously. And then the rest of it was just a big quadrant of steel squares, and it was heavy as hell. And Red had it stored in this, typical of what you would think in this back lot in Los Angeles. And he took me there, and he goes, "We need to put this together in under 2 minutes." And I said, I've got an idea, Red. I said, give me X amount of dollars and I'll meet you here tomorrow and we'll make this happen. And so I took my nephew. My nephew was a big bastard who Red ended up training anyway as well. God rest his soul. He died in a car accident a few years later after Red had trained him. He wrestled in Portland. His name was Scott Peterson. But Scott and I invited Scott to live with me and introduced him to Red because he wanted to be a wrestler too. And so Scott and I ended up building the ring together. And so on this particular occasion, Red gave me the money I asked for, and I went to AutoZone. Actually, it was Pep Boys. I went to Pep Boys and I bought a whole bunch of motorcycle straps. And it's just the pull type motorcycle straps. And I brought him to the yard on the next occasion, and I cut them all. I'd cut them all down to size. I cut all the extra off of them, and it worked out so perfect. I'd cut these motorcycle straps down so they would just fit around the corner of the cage, and then they had about an extra 2 inches or 3 inches of strap so that you had something you could pull on really hard. And actually it was more like a foot, so you could really grab a hold of it and pull these things tight. And I showed Red how we could put this cage together in under a minute. He had all the guys there, and we did a rehearsal, and we put the whole cage together in under a minute. And so the night of WrestleMania, Pat Patterson came up to me and says, "Are you ready for this?" And I said, "You damn right we are." He said, "You can put this together in under 2 minutes." I said, "I think I can put it together in under a minute." And he said, "I'll be happy if you make it 2 minutes." I said, "Okay." So time came, and we literally built, I'd mapped it all out so that we had, he'd hired all the guys that we needed. And I said, "Okay, this is what's going to happen." Everybody had an exact plan. We'd actually rehearsed it that day because he couldn't fuck this up, right? This is one of those things that, the entire country was waiting on the main event, right? So I had it so that each piece of cage went out. The furthest corner was the first one I attached. Then the nearest corner was the next one I attached. So both pieces would stand independently on the apron of the ring. So once I attached the 2 corner pieces, then they would stand independently on the corner of the ring. And then I had guys that would scamper up and do the top, the top ones while they were scampering up to do the top ones on each one of the corner ones. I started attaching all the bottom ones, and we literally did it in 1 minute. And after WrestleMania that night, Pat Patterson gave my nephew and I a $500 bonus for that. And then after that, we ended up taking the cage all over the Western United States because Brutus Beefcake and Greg Valentine had a cage run with the British Bulldogs right after that all over the Western United States. And so because we'd been so successful with the cage building everywhere else, they sent us on the road to build the cage for all of those matches as well. And so we ended up being the cage builders for a while.
And we do have a fan question, which I do want to let him know. Prius Wrestling, we're going to get into that question whenever we get into the WCW days, because it wouldn't make sense to ask it now and then jump back. But I want to say that is a really great question that will get brought up. But I know you mentioned New Japan, and I got to dive into that a little bit because You also trained inside that dojo with a lot of people, and one of them being a little controversial, but
Little,
the wrestler Chris Benoit. I was
yeah.
wondering if you can actually tell us a bit more about the story behind your Japan days, and of course, what was it like working alongside Benoit in the late 1980s?
You know, again, I'm I look back at how my life progressed, and I'm such a lucky man. I really am. I was I was so gifted, so many great things in my life, and working with Chris in the New Japan Dojo is one of those things that I consider one of the highlights of my life. Um, Even though I'm as heartbroken as the rest of the world that his life ended the way it did. It breaks my heart for him, all the families that surrounded. It's tragic beyond belief, but all of my experiences with Chris were so amazing. I actually didn't meet Chris until the lady that recruited us for New Japan was a woman named Chika Kujiroko, and she was the New Japan liaison in America. And she was the one that did all of the recruiting for them, or, she's what I mean by that is she took care of all of the visas for wrestlers who were going on tours for New Japan. So if you were a wrestler and New Japan contacted you and said, "Hey, we want you to come and wrestle for us," then she was the one you went through, and she's the one that took care of your visa. Well, Chris and I were different. Chris and I were actually, they were going to train us as though we were Japanese wrestlers, so to speak. And I mean that metaphorically, of course. But instead of going there for 5 weeks and then just going on tour and being in the American bus, or what they call the gaijin bus in Japan, Chris and I were actually recruited to go there and break into the Japanese wrestling system as Americans in the New Japan dojo. And it's an incredibly interesting story, one I'm very proud of. And quite honestly, the amazing part of it, and it's something I'm working on currently because I want to tell that story. I'm the only guy left that's still alive that actually lived and made it through the New Japan dojo as a trained, actually lived, graduated, so to speak, from New Japan, and went on to have a career. The Japanese did not want to use the Maxx Payne character, so they disavowed me, and there's some other stories that go along with that. A couple of fights that I unfortunately was involved in, but I loved the New Japan dojo, and I didn't meet Chris until Chika and Sakaguchi and an office rep in Japan for New Japan met us in LA. And I got on an airplane with Chris Benoit after meeting him at this restaurant, and flew to Japan in the New Japan dojo in Setagaya-ku. And at that moment, we were forced roommates. And for the next immediate 9 months, and then for the next year and a half, because of back and forth tours during that era, like I said, I was on board with them a lot during that time period. But it was such a blessing to be around Chris. Chris had already worked in Calgary, and anybody who watched Chris could see and understand the obvious influence of Dynamite on Chris. And Chris uh, emulated Dynamite a lot, and Tom had a profound influence on the way Chris thought and worked, and was a Chris and Tom ended up being friends, and it was really obvious when you watched Chris work that Dynamite had so much influence on his work style. But Chris, I just funny. I was just looking through some pictures for someone else for a couple of pictures, and I saw I still have literally countless photos of Chris and I, going to the original capital in Japan is in Kyoto, and we went to this massive castle in Kyoto, and we're sumo wrestling in one of this outdoor sumo rings at the Kyoto castle, and I've got pictures of ancient samurai costumes and Chris and I doing that. Chris and I in Toy Store. And then another guy who came on after that was Brian Adams, who ended up being Crush and Demolition. And then he did a bunch of other stuff too. But he didn't live in the dojo like Chris and I did. He was only there for a very brief time. And it caused a little bit of resentment with Chris and I because we worked our asses off and, spent, months and months and months like this on the edge of the ring apron watching matches, and Brian didn't have to do that. Brian was sort of this guy that they just brought on. They gave him a part in a Japanese movie. And then he had a girlfriend there, and he was also in the service. And so he never lived in the dojo for very long. He was there for, I think, a couple of weeks one time, but the rest of the time he lived in Fusa, which is the American military base in Tokyo. And so I think it was actually in Yokohama. But anyway, so Chris and I were roommates for the entire time I was in Japan, and it was, if I said it was anything but a privilege to work with Chris and know Chris Benoit, I would be lying.
And all that I have to say is I do know, I said this in past interviews I've done with other people, and I do not, and even if the viewers give me some flack, I will say this. I'll always think that Chris Benoit is probably one of the best professional wrestlers to ever lace up a pair of boots. And I say that as a wrestler. I don't know what happened that day in 2008. I don't want to know. But as a professional wrestler, I will say one of the best to ever do it. And that's all I got to say, man. Because if you watch any of Chris's matches, you can't take away what that man did in the squared circle because he was one hell of a great wrestler.
Well, and in the end, quite frankly, DJ, the sacrifices that he made in the ring is what cost him his life. I mean, the reason that he ended up in the position that he was in was because of CTE and the price he paid to be the great Chris Benoit, the big headbutt off the top rope. I was part of that. I mean, I threw him off the top rope. I had Chris and I were tag partners in a Irish street fight against Fit Finley and Bruiser Mostino in Germany, and we fought through the building. And Chris did I launched him off the top rope as hard as I could push him, and I guarantee you he fell from 15, 20 feet in the sky. And Chris paid the price, the ultimate price, didn't he? I mean, and then what happened to his family? No matter how you look at it, there's no way to paint that picture in a good way. There just isn't. But that doesn't take away from, unfortunately, all I have, the memories I have of Chris Benoit are nothing but fine ones, because I didn't know him at the end of his life. He and I, we didn't part ways in a bad way. He just moved on with his life. And when I left the wrestling business, I left the wrestling business. And so I never contacted him again. After I left the WCW, I never spoke to Chris ever again. And I was absolutely crushed to the core when I heard what had happened. And to this day, I still am. But I have nothing but loving, fond memories of Chris Benoit.
And also, a little after Japan, you also had the opportunity to wrestle in Memphis, Tennessee, where you wrestled Jerry the King, well, Jerry Lawler before he was the King, for the CWA Heavyweight Championship. I was wondering if you can actually tell us a bit more about your time with CWA and, of course, working with Jerry the King.
Well, he was the king then already, believe it or not. Yeah, you know, I've said this before. I didn't make, in fact, I lost money working in Memphis. My checks probably averaged $200 a week when I worked in Memphis. That's how bad it was. The
Damn.
territories by that time, Vince had pretty much killed all the independent territories and killed the small business of wrestling because nobody wanted to go watch, those small territories when, you could wait for 2 weeks and the WWF would be in Louisville or they'd be in Memphis or they'd be in Nashville. And, you could go see what you're watching on Saturday night's main event. So who the hell would go watch the CWA when all you had to do was wait a couple weeks, you'd go see the WWF. So by then, the WWF had pretty much killed the small territories, and the Lawler territory, the CWA, was no different. But, but, having said that, I had no more profound, no more exciting, no more amazing time in my life than working in Memphis for the almost a year I was in Memphis. The people that I got to know, and that includes everybody. One of the things that doesn't get talked about much and is the women of wrestling. And wrestling has, I'm sure it still does, has a substantial amount of women who follow. And now wrestling's full of obviously great women wrestlers. I watch the women wrestlers of today, and it's literally amazing. But I'm talking about a different caliber of woman. They used to call them rats. It's a horrible name for these women because so often they were such an integral part of carrying these guys during a time when if you're only making $200 a week and you've got women who help you get up and down that highway and look after you, you couldn't do it without them. It was such an integral part of the business at that time. And I got to tell you that the business and the CWA, I had just some of the most amazing experiences of my life traveling up and down that highway in primarily Kentucky, Indiana, Tennessee, Arkansas, Mississippi. Um, just it was hard as hell. Absolutely, just one of the most difficult times of my life, but so memorable. It's really unbelievable. And working for Lawler and working with Lawler was it was always a night off, because he was just so easy to work with. Everybody wanted to work with him because when that strap came down, the shit was on. And so working with Lawler was such a blessing. He taught me so much: how to be patient, how to wait, how to sell, how to take. God, he sold his ass off for big heels. He's the guy who created all the great big heels of he's so instrumental in so many people who passed through the WWF. I don't even think you could measure the impact of Jerry Lawler on the wrestlers who passed through the WWF. he was such a great mentor in so many ways. I have nothing but great things to say about Jerry Lawler.
And even with Jerry Lawler, as you said, such a phenomenal worker. I mean, one of his most memorable storylines is with Andy Kaufman, as we all
Oh,
know,
of
from
course.
Taxi.
Right.
I will tell you this, Max, and I'm not just saying this for the sake of the conversation. For years, I thought that shit was real. For years, I actually thought these two like hated each other. And then I watch a documentary and I'm like, wait, what? I'm like, I know wrestling is like it's very much real, but it's scripted and whatnot. So I always thought that was real heat. I didn't know that was kayfabe. So I was like, oh shit. Like that's how good Lawler was. It slipped right past me for years until I watched the documentary.
You know that, but then DJ, there's no need to apologize for that. That's what's so great about wrestling is the willing suspense of disbelief. You know, when you watch, if you watch a great wrestling match, that's the whole genius of professional wrestling. It doesn't detract from it that it's fixed. It doesn't detract from it that they, even if they knew every single move, even if they knew every single move was planned in a wrestling match, does that take away from how difficult it is to perform? Does it take away from the danger that comes from understanding how all that works and the truth of the matter? That's what I've always been an advocate for complete exposure years ago, years and years ago. In fact, I've got a movie that's going to be coming out very soon that exposes it at a level that cost me my place in the wrestling business, because everybody hated me so bad because I shot this movie 30 years ago that now the WWF just released almost identically the same kind of movie I shot 30 years ago in Unreal. They've completely exposed the business to the point where it doesn't matter about all of that. What matters, this is the part. Here's what I'm trying to say by this. Let's compare wrestling to ballet for a second. And I've done this many a times. Is there any question in anyone's mind, if you've ever watched ballet, and you don't have to love it to watch ballet and know this is for real, that this is true. When you watch a ballet, is there any question that every single movement, even the hand gestures that they use, is there any question that every single movement of a ballet is choreographed from beginning to end? We all would agree that we know there is no improvisation in a ballet, right? That from the beginning of it till it ends, every single piece of it is choreographed to give the audience the greatest effect of how it's presented on a stage. Does that make ballet any less accessible or any more accessible for the average person? Does that make it any less difficult? Does that make it any less self-sacrificing than if you've watched or know anything about ballet artists? Their time, that it is completely a young person's sport, that by the time most of them are 25 years old, they've destroyed their knees, their backs, their hips, their elbows, their shoulders. No, we all know that for a fact. And just like ice skating, let's use ice skating for another example. When you watch an ice skating performance in the Olympics, is there any question that every single turn, every movement, every blade scratch is choreographed from beginning to end? And the answer is no, because you sit down, just like in a motion picture, and you go, okay, I'm here, entertain me, make me happy. Because that's what we want. We want to be entertained. So we willingly suspend our disbelief that we know it's not spontaneous, but they make us believe it's spontaneous because they're so professional and so good at what they do. I believe now with Unreal. And this is what I believe 30 years ago when I shot the movie that I shot, that the behind the scenes story of professional wrestling, and Unreal proves it. Unreal absolutely proves what I'm talking about. Have you seen Unreal, DJ?
I have, yes. I've seen the Elimination Chamber episode. That's the one
No,
I went to.
any question about how wrestling works is now all eliminated. There's no ambiguity about whether the winners or losers. It's completely and utterly fixed in the back rooms. Now the only objective they need to maintain is secrecy, so that the finishes don't get out to the public, so that they can go out and watch a match and really suspend their disbelief and watch the match as though they don't know the outcome, which is what the point of it is. But here's my point in this. Because of that, now, and I believe this with all my heart, wrestling can now go to a whole different kind of realm that it's never gone to before. And here's what I mean. You could actually now put professional wrestling in the Olympics, but it's not judged for the spontaneity of the winners and losers like an amateur wrestling match. It's judged like a ballet or an ice skating performance on how well they perform the mandatories, the compulsories. Do they do all the things, and does the heel make you believe them from beginning to the end? Is the baby face's comeback as fiery? They can hold up the cards. The Japanese believed this 30 years ago too, when Tiger Mask wrote the book Kayfabe in Japan. So most people don't know, but a guy named Tiger Mask exposed the business 30 years ago in Japan and said the same thing. And so the Japanese have known this forever, and they immediately accepted it and now love wrestling for the exact reason that I'm talking about. Can you convince me? When I sit down and go, okay, bring your A game, can you make me believe? And that's what you were just talking about. Lawler was so all the way back to your point with Andy Kaufman. Lawler was so good at his craft that even this many years later, you believe that. That's one hell of a fine compliment to Jerry Lawler. That you this many years later didn't realize that the whole thing was a work. And to me, wrestling now, because of Unreal, because of where they're at, now you could have wrestling clubs in high school. Now you could literally get wrestling to the point where people now cheer for. It's like almost like a Rocky Horror Picture Show mentality. From the moment the heels come out, the baby faces come out. Oh, that was a hell of a believable performance. I didn't believe that last little episode there. It might not have been believable. I'll only give him an 8.5 on that maneuver. That's the kind of judging now wrestling could inherit. And maybe it can take and go to different places it never imagined it could go to before.
And also, as well, I have to say, because I do know you've done a lot of amazing things and worked at so many amazing companies, with one of them actually being WCW, that in '93, Bill Watts of World Championship Wrestling hired you, and you made your debut on January 30th of that year in '93, where you wrestled Scott Allen on WCW Worldwide. I was wondering if you can actually just tell us the story behind your contract with the WCW, and of course, how did you first get contacted with Bill?
So I was really, again, I was so fortunate, the territories that I've worked in, to be around just really amazing people. And of course, I was trying to now work my way back into the show. And at the time, because WCW had created an alternative working place to the WWF, by '93, now the WCW came to prowess and was offering contracts that were incredible. Ted Turner had decided to put his full weight behind the WCW and had vowed basically to compete with Vince. And so I was in Germany, and I was committed to developing the Maxx Payne character, which I was absolutely devoted to being the first legitimate guitar playing wrestler. That's what I honestly believe that was my said to be niche that I was going to create in the wrestling business. And so despite incredible pushback from the promoter in Germany, Otto Wanz, luckily there's another promoter in Germany named Peter Williams, who was a very flamboyant. I don't think he was gay, but I would probably say, I know he was bisexual at the very minimum, but he was an incredibly flamboyant man who loved the entertainment side of wrestling, and especially characters who brought that flamboyancy. So, like, he loved this guy named Salvatore Bellomo. And because Sal was this incredible Italian wrestler who came there, and if you know anything about Sal, he was so incredibly, flamboyant. So I wanted to create that same kind of a flamboyant character, but I wanted the dark side of flamboyance. I wanted the Alice Cooper, Kiss, Black Sabbath, David Bowie. I was after that kind of flamboyance, and I believe the way to do that was through the heavy metal guitar routine. And so against Otto, but for Peter, I went to Peter Williams. We were in Hanover, and Peter ran the town of Hanover, Germany. Otto took care of Vienna, Bremen, Graz, and Dortmund, but Peter Williams ran Hanover, which was about 70 days in the same place. Same tent, same building every single night for 70 days. And so when we got to Hanover, I convinced Peter to let me introduce the Maxx Payne character, but he wouldn't let me call him Maxx Payne. He made me call him, because I was at the time, they called me Buffalo Pedersen, which I hated, but I did it because it got me the gig there. But I convinced him into letting me do the Maxx Payne character, and he said, okay, you can do it, but you have to go by Heavy Metal Buffalo. And I said, well, okay, I can live with that. So I went out as Heavy Metal Buffalo, and I was so lucky because it changed. Hanover at that time wasn't a very good town. We didn't do very good business. And because of Heavy Metal Buffalo, things changed, and we got really busy, and it was good for all the boys because, you start, the more people, the easier it is to work, the more gimmicks you have to sell, the more food the tent sells, the more money the promoter makes. Everybody loves you if you start putting asses in seats. And because of the Heavy Metal Buffalo character, we started putting more asses in seats. And Otto Wanz wasn't going to use my Heavy Metal Buffalo character following Hanover, but had he not, actually the German people demanded that he let me play in Bremen, Germany, and the fans forced him to bringing back Heavy Metal Buffalo and letting me play in Germany. And there's a video out there online of me playing in Bremen, Germany on, I think it was December 18th or something like that, 1992, my last match that I wrestled in the CWA, which is what that organization was called in Bremen, Germany. And I played the guitar before I went out, and then I wrestled the Warlord that night. You can actually find that video online, and it was amazing. Well, one of the characters that was on tour with me that season was a guy named Rip Rogers. And Rip and I became amazing, amazing friends. And anybody who knows Rip knows this about him. He knows everybody. And he knew Bill Watts really well. In fact, he had his number in Atlanta because he was constantly trying to get on for Bill, but Bill didn't wouldn't give Rip the kind of work that he wanted. He just Rip is one of those pretty strong characters, and you either love him or hate him. And I adore the man, and I see nothing but the greatness in Rip because he is one incredibly gifted wrestler and always has been. And he and I became very, very good friends. And one day he goes, "Come with me, Buff." And he goes, "You got a bunch of coins?" And I said, "No." He said, "Go get about $100 worth of Deutschmarks. We're going to a phone." And we went to a phone booth and started dropping Deutschmarks into a phone. And he called Bill Watts on the phone. And when I left Bremen, Germany at the end of 1992, Bill called me, or I called Bill, and he flew me to Atlanta as soon as I got home, and gave me a job on the spot for the WCW, and that was all because of Rip Rogers.
And also in the WCW, you actually went on to form an amazing tag team with Cactus Jack, also known as Mick Foley. I was wondering if you can actually tell us a bit more about your time working with Cactus Jack, and of course, whose idea was it to partner you guys up? Because you guys had a phenomenal run together.
I'd like to believe, from what I remember, it was Mick that somebody made the suggestion, and I think Mick he and I we'd met and talked enough that we were already pretty good friends. So if I'm not mistaken, Mick approached me about being his tag partner in the WCW. He had quite a bit of clout then in WCW, and he asked me to come on board with him. And as you can imagine, I didn't hesitate a second. Now, it might have been more coincidental than that we did a little tag. We might have just, if I'm starting to remember, excuse me, I'm starting to remember, I think we may have done a tag team together in Disney, because at the time WCW was shooting at Disney. And I think we did a tag team maybe together, and that kind of sparked an idea in somebody, and it carried on from there. I'm not exactly sure. Mick would be able to tell you that much better than I am, because at the time I'm pretty good at substance abuse. I got like 2 or 3 PhDs in it. But Mick and I really found a common ground. He loved the darkness that I brought. He found great humor in using me as the straight man in the back of his incredible promos. And so a lot of times he would sit around just contemplating these great ideas for using me as the guy that was, the the guy that promoted any of his crazy ideas. And I love that about Mick. Mick was my best cheerleader for the entire time we were tag team partners. So I look back at my time with Mick Foley as nothing but amazing from beginning to end.
And that actually brings us to the fan question I was talking about. Prius Wrestling actually wants to know, as Cactus Jack's tag team partner, what was the most baffling item you actually saw come out of his gym bag? Was it a clean shirt, or just more barbed wire and socks full of quarters?
It's so funny because I think that, okay, so this is the best way for me to answer that is the part about the reason that Mick and I were so good together is nothing Mick did made me go, I never did that with him because because he was so much my kind of wrestler and my kind of guy. We got along so good at so many levels that he could have pulled a dead carcass out of his bag and I wouldn't have even thought twice about it because it was just Mick, you know? So those kinds of things I don't remember because I was my own level of craziness, which is the part Mick loved about me. You know, that was the part that he took such great advantage of as partners. He used that to better our tag team structure. And yet that's the part of him that I never looked at and went, "Oh God, are you kidding?" I never thought that way about Mick. Mick, privied me to knowing his family, and I met his wife. He invited me into his home. I was. That's the part of Mick that I loved so much. We ended up being really incredible friends. That nothing he did surprised me because it was Mick. And I just accepted that from him as well as that's the way he treated me. So I'm sorry that I can't go, yeah, this one time he pulled out nothing he would have done would have made me go, wow, Mick, that's unique.
And so, while we're still on the topic of yourself and Mick Foley, Cactus Jack, you guys also had a feud with the Nasty Boys, where you actually also at one point almost became the WCW World Tag Team Champions, where you guys did a street fight at Spring Stampede in 1994, and you also actually went on to wrestling at Super Brawl as well. I was wondering if you can actually tell us a bit more about working with the Nasty Boys, because I do know they were some stiff SOBs back in the day, man. You could just tell by watching it on TV.
You know, I've said this before and I'll say it again. I They don't feel the same way about me, but I love both of them very, very much. They were stiff son of a bitches. And then the shitty part about it is I'm not saying anything that anybody hasn't said before. Not only were they stiff as shit, but then it looked like crap too. And but that was okay because I did the road with Knobs and Sags, and I loved both of them with all of my heart. I gotta tell you, I I have nothing. Even though Brian set forth to absolutely destroy my career because he believed I hurt him intentionally, um, I love both of them from the bottom of my heart. I had so many good times with them on the road. I, I, I wouldn't even know where to begin. I spent so much free time with them, I can't even begin to tell you. On top of the fact, they loved my musical connection. Nick Patrick and I had the same guitar rig, and we used to play the guitars in our hotel room. And the Nasty Boys, especially Knobs, man, he would come to our room and sit there for hours and listen to us play the guitar. And he would pick songs sometimes and go, "Hey, learn how to play this," and we did. I mean, I remember the song. I think it's "Two Poppers" by. Oh my gosh, I can't remember the name of the band now. It's right on the tip of my tongue. But anyway, he asked us to learn a song, and I learned the song. Nick and I learned the song, and we used to play that for them all the time. And we'd play, Metallica songs, and we just, I had a great, great time with Knobs and Sags. So, despite what anybody else might say, and I said this to Jerry the last time I saw both of them. I said, I don't give a shit what anybody says. to you about me, I want you both to know I love you both, and I think the world of you. And thank you for all of the great times we spent together. I love you both dearly, and you say what you're going to say about me, and I'm going to say what I say about you, but that doesn't take away about the way I feel truly in my heart. I feel about both of you. Despite, like I said, Knobs really went out of his way to destroy my career, and they both did once they joined in. But you know what? I forgive them. I have no animosity about that because we had some amazing matches together, and I believe it or not, it wasn't the Nasty Boys that stopped us from working together. It was actually Mick is the one that decided that he and I were no longer going to partner. The Nasty Boys had nothing to do with that.
And if you don't mind me asking, what made Mick actually come to that decision? Because if you just as a fan that viewed this on television and pay-per-view, you guys had some phenomenal chemistry as a tag team.
You know, I know the whole story. It was Mick's distrust of me, but I've told the story in other environments, and it's a big one. It's a big, long story. I would prefer to actually play a little tennis in this case. That if you really want to know why Mick left me, I think people are going to have to start asking Mick's version of that story. I've spoken my version publicly on many occasions, but believe it or not, the biggest reason Mick and I divided as tag team partners was because of rock legend Steve Miller.
Damn. Okay. That actually. So people need to start asking Mick Foley because that sounds like it sounds pretty juicy. It's all I gotta say.
Well, and actually, you know, I've done other podcasts where people have asked me that, and I've told that story. If you want me to tell that story, I'd gladly come back and do it another time. But it's a huge story that involves the creation of my band and the writing of my album and the bringing of all these musicians that I hired and brought to Atlanta to create this record with me. But that was one of the primary reason that Mick and I divided was because of Steve Miller.
And one of the last WCW questions I have, because obviously, as we spoke about, you joined the company in 1993 and you left late in 1994 before venturing off to the World Wrestling Federation. But around that time in 94, you had like Lex Luger, you had Hulk Hogan, you had a lot of these big guys from the WWF kind of coming over to the WCW. And you were there kind of in the midst of all of it in World Championship Wrestling. I was wondering if you can actually just tell us a bit more about the atmosphere. What was it? Was the atmosphere backstage changing a lot as these big, well-known, great wrestlers were actually coming into the WCW from the WWF?
Oh yeah. The dressing rooms, the environment of the WCW. I left sort of right in that transitionary period. Yeah, it was dramatically changing. Eric Bischoff did not like me, partly because the guys that would eventually come there to form the NWO did not like me. Scott Hall, Kevin Nash, Triple H. Even though I don't think Triple H didn't go to the NWO, I don't think he ever left New York. But Scott and Nash, or Hall and Nash, both did, and they did not like me at all. And so the dressing room had really, and the whole environment of the WCW with the advent of the power of Eric Bischoff changed dramatically. And like I said, Bischoff had made it really clear to me that he didn't like me. And so, you know, when you're faced with those kinds of scenarios, you start planning, differently. I was never, and I've said this publicly over and over again, I was never a fan of the dressing room in any company. I, which was probably one of my biggest downfalls, is I found it much more appealing to align myself with the enhancement guys dressing room. The egos in the enhancement guy room was so different, and those guys were, such different kind of people. um I loved them, and a lot of them would come and stay in my apartment, and I looked after them because they were such, I love the underdog. Those were the guys they're trying to get a job. I was one of them. There's plenty of enhancement matches with Daryl Peterson in the WWF. So, if you want to see me getting my ass beat by Hercules Hernandez or Bret Hart, or, Jake the Snake Roberts getting the snake thrown on me, or Jim Duggan, I got my ass whooped by all of those guys because I was trying to get a job in one of the big organizations too. So I found hanging with the enhancement guys to be so much more pleasurable and so much less stressful because the dressing room ego didn't quite exist. So, to maybe my own demise, I don't care because I wouldn't have changed anything. I found it much better to hang with the enhancement guys. So I did my best to distance myself from that dressing room, which is probably a lot of the reason that, Eric Bischoff didn't like me, because he didn't know me. I didn't sit in there with all the other guys and then, spend my time sucking ass trying to get my way to the top that way. I had a few friends in the dressing room that I valued greatly. One of them was Harley Race, and I got along good with Vader. Harley tried to get the powers that be to do a run with me and Vader, but because they didn't believe in me enough, they they wouldn't they wouldn't do it. So, and I think Eric Bischoff had already saw he envisioned me as on my way out. So that never happened. So that's that's what I remember about the dressing rooms. Is for me, I always hung with the guys that were the most real, and to me, that was always the enhancement guys.
And also, I just have to say quickly, you and Vader would have been such an amazing feud, man. Two big heavyweight brutes going back to back. I mean, honestly, I really think that would have made the arena shake, in my honest opinion.
But they just they for whatever reason, and there's plenty of them, I'm sure. I've read what Eric Bischoff has said about me. Um, they they made it pretty abundantly clear that they weren't going to use, and they didn't. And they, for whatever, I don't, whether they just didn't. It doesn't matter what the reason was. They didn't see that. And I would have loved to work with Leon. The times that I did work with Leon, I've watched the matches several times. I loved him. I loved working with Leon. I wasn't afraid of being pummeled by him, and he wasn't afraid of being pummeled by me. I was there when he broke in Japan like this, sitting on the edge of the ring, watching him wrestle for the first time in the Tokyo Dome. So, I had no problems with Leon. The same goes for Bam Bam. I loved Bam Bam. He and I we got along like gangbusters. But the era and the age of the fat guys really started to die with the NWO. They didn't want the big fat heel was quickly becoming a thing of the past. as it is now. That era of just big fat dudes is, you know, there's not too much of that left in the business.
And before we move on to the World Wrestling Federation days, as we all know, there was WCW, there was a WWF, but another big company that was currently going on in the mid 1990s was ECW. Was there any times that Eastern Championship Wrestling or Extreme Championship Wrestling and Paul Heyman called Ring in your phone? Was there any talks about getting you to the ECW before you ventured to the WWF?
Again, you'd have to ask, Paul. Just I don't know why, but I never heard from Paul, not once. And it always blew me away because I thought I would have been the perfect character for ECW. But there's I have my own sneaking suspicions why that is. But I could never confirm that, and I would hate to say what those suspicions are and have them be wrong, because I know what it feels like to have somebody think that way of you and it not be true. And so I wouldn't do that to anybody else. But I think there were some people behind the scenes working against me in ECW that did their damnedest to make sure that I didn't have an opportunity there.
And I'm just saying, in another universe, it would have been really cool to see you tag team with Axel Rotten and then come out with some heavy metal music and just feud with the Public Enemy or something, man. I think that would have been totally badass.
I think let's put it this way. I've heard a lot of people say this before. I think that anybody who watched my character from that era, that watched the Maxx Payne character and truly liked the Maxx Payne character, I think that almost all of the fans from that era would agree that those promotions, including the WWF, who didn't use me correctly, left a lot of money on the table by not using the Maxx Payne character in a way that all I cared about was making money. That's the part of the wrestling business, like we talked about earlier, which is this is a nice, sort of roundabout way of getting back to what we talked about earlier is, I would have loved to have, it's all about making money. In the WWF and the WCW, professional wrestling is about attracting eyeballs and bringing fans to the arena because there's a character that they can identify with. And I think I was that character that if one promoter, would have really taken a look at the guitar playing character that was Maxx Payne in the way that they could have gone, wow, we could make some money with this guy. Nothing else. All of the bullshit you hate, whether I get along with those guys in the dressing room or anything else, if one promoter would have really dug in with me, I think there was so much money left on the table they can't even begin to imagine what they could have made with me. And maybe I'm just full of shit, so I'll accept that. I guarantee you the first thing they would say is, no, Max sucked and he wasn't believable as a character, he wasn't a good wrestler, whatever. That's fine. But I think that there's enough people out there that would say, there's a lot of promoters that could have made a lot of money with me and they chose not to.
And of course, upon your departure from WCW, I read that you were actually contacted by Ravishing Rick Rude, God bless his soul, but
Yeah.
he contacted you about, and behind this phone call that you guys had together that ultimately led to you joining the Federation in '95. Can you tell us the story behind the call? And of course, how did Rick actually get in contact with you originally?
Well, Reed and I, we met through WCW, and we did the road together. We ended up being amazing friends, and I gotta say, Rick Rude was one of those people that man, he was something special. I mean, he was really a world class guy in my world, and I'll never forget. He called me one day, and it was it. I don't know to this day. I don't know if he'd heard, and he called me to appease me, but he called me one day and he goes, Payne, what's going on? I go, oh, I'm just trying to figure out what I'm going to do. It looks like I'm looking for a job. And he goes, what do you mean? I go, Gary Juster just called me and they just fired me. They just let me go. And he goes, what? And I said, yeah. He goes, I'll be right there. And I lived in Marietta at the time, Georgia, just north of the center of Atlanta. And he showed up to my house and he goes, well, I'll fix this. He goes, hold on a second. He got his cell phone out. And no, it wasn't a cell phone. What am I kidding? It was a landline in my house. He picked up my phone and punched in a bunch of numbers. He goes, let me talk to Vince. And he had Vince on the phone in 2 minutes. And Vince talked to me, and like within 2 or 3 days, I was on my way to New York. So it was Rude that got me my job in New York.
And it just shows the character of Ravishing Rick Rude as well, because we all know he also made history by being on not one, not two, but three different wrestling promotions in 1 week. People say the same night, WCW, Nitro, and Raw, but people tend to forget he also walked down the stage in ECW the same week. So I mean that it just shows how many people wanted him in the mid 90s, man, because he had his hand in every single company.
Well, number one reason is because in the ring, he was unstoppable. I mean, he was such a world-class heel. He's up there with, I heard somebody say, I watched a little tidbit last night about Roddy Piper being the greatest heel of all time. And I would agree with that. Roddy Piper was unbelievable. Macho Man, another one. And right there with those two is Rick Rude. Rude was one of the greatest. Oh, he was such a great heel and such an impeccable. His work was impeccable. And anybody who worked with Rude knew it was a night off. And if you were a baby face and you got in the ring with Rude, you didn't have to say a word. He would take care of you and you'd leave the ring looking like $1 million because that's who Rude was. And I have, again, another guy that I would never even, you couldn't even get me to act like I was going to veer towards saying a bad word about Rick Rude because he was astonishingly amazing. He really was. And I have nothing but fond memories of him.
And also in the World Wrestling Federation, as we all know, the Federation was going through a really big transitional period back then. You had a lot of different gimmicks from Sparkplug, which went on to be Hardcore Holly. You had Sir Isaac Yankem, which was Kane, and of course Duke the Dumpster, all IRS and whatnot. But when they came to you about Man Mountain Rock, what was your thoughts on it? Because obviously I do know it was up your alley with being a rock and roller and whatnot, but the name and everything, did you actually like the name and the direction they were going with your gimmick at first when they first brought it up to you?
Looking back in retrospect, I can honestly say that there's very few times in my wrestling career that I knew I should have said no and didn't. And the Man Mountain Rock character, I'm always afraid of disparaging him because there are a lot of Man Mountain Rock fans out there still to this day. It boggles my mind that even to this day, there are some really incredible Man Mountain Rock fans out there. but the problem is Mick Foley, these were his exact words, is they, what was the exact word he used to describe it, is basically they stripped me of all of my Maxx Payne integrity to create Man Mountain Rock. You know, I wasn't a tie-dye guy. I was a black #1 guy. I was a black t-shirt with white skulls guy. I was, you know, that guy that wanted to play my own music, but Jim Johnston was so he painted the picture that I wasn't capable, and so because he wanted to be the guy to play my guitar stuff, I couldn't stand what Jim Johnston brought to the table, the music that Jim Johnston brought to the table for the Man Mountain Rock character. So whenever you saw like any promos, the only time they ever let me play my guitar was on my way to the ring, in the you know, on the television. When I would go to the ring, they would let me. There were 4 or 5 times they let me play my guitar, and I didn't even get to write the background music for that. I just had, you know, Jim Johnson called me and said, "What key do you want it to be in?" I said A, and he wrote basically a 1-4-5 12-bar turnaround in A, and I went out there and played to his freaking music. By then I'd already written an album's worth of material. I already had my own intros, but the WWF completely and utterly stripped me of all of my uniqueness. And, you know, it was really, really difficult for me to pull off the Man Mountain Rock character, which is why on my last tour in Europe, I took my video camera with me, is because I wanted to prove to Vince that given the opportunity that the people would love, you know, he could have made money with me, that people loved when I played the guitar and the company got behind me. And because of some incredible coincidences, because they weren't going to let me play even on my last tour, which was called the Full Metal Tour, they weren't even going to let me play then. But because of an accident that happened to Louis Muccioli, they were forced to, because they needed somebody to fill in some time and space. And they gave it to me begrudgingly, but in the end, it worked out great for me because I ended up playing 4 or 5 different nights on the road in Europe. And I got to do exactly what I wanted to, was shoot video of me playing in front of German crowds and in front of the crowds, so they could have an opportunity to decide whether they liked me or not. And it was very successful. And I have videotape to prove it. It's going to come out even this many years later, 30 years later. I don't have to lie or bullshit. The truth of the matter is it really happened. And people loved that gimmick. And had the WWF had the courage, had Vince had the courage to stand behind me at that time and not believe Hall and Nash and Triple H, they would have seen how successful, and the world will see for themselves when this movie finally comes out. You can decide for yourself when you see what I was going through just trying to survive during that era.
And I do know as well, if I'm not mistaken, the documentary is actually called "The Thing That Should Not Be," or "The Real Maxx Payne." With that being said, I have heard that you captured more than just music on this videotape, and we don't have to get into details. Like, you obviously you want to have some surprises for the fans. But with that being said, is there much more than just Maxx Payne music captured on these videotapes?
You know, DJ, I think there's so much more captured that once this thing comes out, you're going to be on the horn with me really quick to go, Max, when you coming back on. And I will come back on. I promise you I will. Because it's loaded. It's really loaded with Like I said, I'm proud as hell of it because it's unreal 30 years ago, and we'll see what happens with it. You know, it's out of my hands now. I've turned it over to someone else because it's way too close to my heart. I wrote all the music for it, as well as I shot the video from beginning to end. So actually, there's one piece I didn't shoot, and it's probably one of the most amazing pieces in the movie. I was standing right next to Triple H when he actually was pulling the trigger, and again, I'll come back on your show and we'll talk about that. But I believe that this movie is. I think the world, the wrestling world, is. I'm excited to see what happens. Maybe I'm just full of shit, and maybe the wrestling world is going to hate me even more than they already do, because I wasn't afraid to expose what was going on behind the scenes at the time, because I really believed that what made wrestling interesting was the shit that happened on the other side of the curtain. And so we'll see what happens with it when it finally comes out. But I have a feeling that there's going to be a lot of people that have a lot more questions for me once this comes out, because it's incredibly interesting. It's loaded with, and to be honest with you, God rest the souls of those who have passed that are in it. There's a lot of folks that are no longer with us that are in this movie, and their cameos are stunning, to say the least. So it's just loaded with things. You know, I had a film director say something to me once that I believe about this movie, that it possesses the three R's that make this documentary really, really important. It's real, it's raw, and it's rare. And this movie has all three of those elements really wrapped up, because it was October of 1995. You know, that's 30 years before Unreal came out. So that part I'm really proud of, because I saw what Triple H finally just released to the public 30 years ago. And I believed in it with all my heart. In fact, it cost me my place in the wrestling business. Everybody I've ever talked to, you know, Steve Regal told me that the biggest reason that I was blackballed was because of the thing that should not be. Well, if that's the case, that all changed with Unreal, didn't it?
It did, yeah. But the good thing is you have the real Unreal. You have the tapes that, let's just say, make Unreal look like a kid's story. That's all I have to say, because I looked a little bit more into this, and I'm not going to let any cats out of the bag. But from what I read that you actually found on that video, man, makes Unreal look like a little kid's treehouse story. That's all I got to say. So, and I think,
Well, I'll tell you,
people are going to be
I'll
surprised when
tell
they
you,
see it, man.
well, let me put it this way, DJ. I think what's going to be different about it is it's not it's not shot from a WWF perspective. It's shot from a guy who's trying his ass off to save a career he'd invested 15 years of his life in. And I knew, and not only do I know, the people that are on the movie who are trying to burn me and burn my career, they're not afraid to do it to me in front of my face on the movie. So the guys who hate me waste no time in hating me on my own video. So it's not like, you know, they're nice to me when they're on camera with me, you know. So that's the difference, is the difference in what my movie brings to the table is guys like Kevin Nash and Scott Hall and Triple H. They make it really clear what they think of me to my face. So then the world can decide for themselves everything else. because I didn't shoot this from the agenda of making them happy or trying to butter up the WWF. I was actually shooting this for Vince McMahon to try and save my career, because I believed if I could show Vince this video, he would see that the guitar playing Man Mountain Rock character could make you money. You know, that given the kind of nurturing Vince was good at, had Vince trusted me the way he did initially and nurtured that character, the potential to make money with that character was so missed. It was just completely and utterly missed. And I hope the movie portrays that, and people, who knows, maybe I'll have to, move to Sweden after it comes out, because I'll be hated even more. I don't know. I guess we'll let the movie be the de facto decider of that.
And when you said cameos as well, the one person I have to ask if they're a part of it is Brian, the loose cannon Brian Pillman. Is he actually seen on these tapes? Because, in my opinion,
WWF at the time.
Pardon?
There.
Oh, he wasn't?
No. No, yes. Brian was not on that. The loose cannon that is on there is oh my God. He's gonna be so mad at me that I'm forgetting her.
I feel like as a Flying Brian fan, I should actually remember what date he came. What date this is? I don't think he came in the WWF till '96. So clearly, I'm messing up my own dates here.
This is October '95, and Shane Douglas was the loose cannon. Shane Douglas, he speaks his mind pretty passionately on this in this movie. There's going to be some surprise stars. There's going to be people that come out in this. I'm going to just tell you right now, one of the greatest characters in this movie is Tony Gurria. He is truly one of the funniest, naturally funny, charismatic people you've ever met in your life. Louis Puccioli, God rest his soul. Owen Hart, God rest his soul. Yokozuna, God rest his soul. There's just Mr. Fuji, God rest his soul. Bam Bam, God rest his soul. The list goes on. There's so many amazing performances in this movie by people who just, you'll never forget their performances in this. They bring something to the table that no one's ever seen before. There's just so many parts of them that no one has ever seen these characters before. And so for that, I'm incredibly excited. For their families as well, because there's really beautiful things about their performances in this video.
And one of the last questions I do have, because I want to save some stuff as well for a part 2 when we do that, but in the year 2000, so jumping ahead 5 years after you left the World Wrestling Federation, you worked for the National Wrestling Alliance in Mississippi, where you actually went on to win the Tapped Fist Championship. I was wondering if you can actually tell us a bit more about your time at the NWA. And of course, what was it like just being a part of such a prestigious wrestling promotion that is extraordinarily amazing, because it's still going on 70 plus years today?
That is not me.
Really?
That is not me. When I retired, when I walked away from the business in Germany in 1996, yes, it would have been the last gig I did in the wrestling business was Brian James and I went together to wrestle in Austria to the CWA again for Otto Vons and Peter Williams. And part of the reason I wanted to go is because I really believed that I could talk Brian, who is the lead singer in my band, into you know who I'm talking about, Brian James.
Yeah.
So there's a whole nother story behind that. Brian James, basically, I'd lived with him for a year, almost a year in Atlanta while I recorded this album. I basically carried him for a year while we recorded this album in Atlanta, and I really believed that if we got together, I was trying desperately to get him to get back into the musical side of it with me so that we could take it back to the WWF. But Brian had other designs, and God bless him, he had his own career he was interested in. So he didn't want to do it with me. He wanted to go back to the WWF and work with Jeff Jarrett and go back to what he was doing with them without me being a part of that. And I had to accept that. It wasn't easy to accept, but I did. And I realized then that my job, I needed to go home and raise my children. And when Brian left, we left together. He went back to the WWF, and I went back to Utah. This would have been probably July of '96. I left the business, and I never looked back. I never wrestled again.
And I'm glad you actually cleared that up, because I read that on fandom.com, and I do know that you retired in the 90s and whatnot, but I thought maybe because sometimes individuals, if they get a good enough deal or a sweet enough, paycheck, they might be like, you know what, let me lace up the boots one more time or a couple more times. But fandom.com needs to edit that, because when I read that, I was like, okay, it's NWA, got to bring it up. But fandom.
That wasn't me. That I when I left, the last time I laced my boots was I know I didn't wrestle again. I might have done. Okay, wait 1 second. So is this? I did a show, but I didn't wrestle, and it was, man, the band Guar was there, but I never went and did anything. I never wrestled again. That's a fact. So if anybody's saying I wrestled beyond that time, I never wrestled again. Killer Kowalski had me come to one of his shows once, and I played the national anthem at one of his shows. I don't think I wrestled there, but if I wrestle, no, I didn't wrestle ever again. I'm positive. I never pulled my boots on again after I went and did promotional things, but I never wrestled again after '96.
And also, with that being said, you also went on to do a lot of amazing acting as well. You were in The Substitute, which is like the third equation of that movie. You also did 2 episodes of Touched by an Angel, and I have to ask, because I feel like we can't talk about your wrestling career and not touch on a little bit of your an amazing movie career. What was it like being a part of Touched by an Angel 2 times? Because any 90s kid knows that that was the show that you were always stuck watching with your parents. Whether you liked it or you didn't, you were always stuck watching it. But as an adult, I can learn to appreciate it, man. As an adult, it's a pretty kick-ass show. But as a kid, I was like, God damn, man, I just want to watch Power Rangers.
Yeah, no kidding, right? I was really lucky. When I left the business, so all the way back to Takedown, I met a lady by the name of Susie McCarty in Salt Lake. And Susie ran the biggest casting agency in the state of Utah. And so I knew her through my aunt. I had an auntie that lived in Salt Lake, and she was a socialite and good friends with Susie McCarty, who was, like I said, the biggest casting agency in the state of Utah. And any television or movie production that went through the state of Utah came across the desk of the McCarty casting agency. So when I left the wrestling business in '96, The first thing I did was call my auntie on the phone, ask her if she'd call Susie, and Susie met me for dinner. And I went to dinner with Susie, and she hired me immediately. And the first gig I got from the McCarty casting agency was a voiceover gig for a video game called Rogue Trip, which was the third installment of the Twisted Metal series. And in Twisted Metal 2, there's a commercial advertising Rogue Trip, and I'm the voice in that. You can actually see the commercial that I'm talking about is on the Payne layer on my YouTube channel, and you can go see the commercial that was in Twisted Metal 2, which was the promo for Road Trip. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because that's the scene that eventually caused me to have to go to battle with the people who stole my name and used it to create a video game called Maxx Payne. And I settled with them out of court. I can't talk much about it because I have an NDA with them. And but it was not a nuisance settlement with them. We settled before it went to court. If I'd had a better lawyer, it would have been a much better settlement. But I was really lucky working for Susie because I ended up doing this movie called "A Town Has Turned to Dust." Starred Stephen Lang, the guy who was in Avatar. It had Ron Perlman in it. It had Judy Collins, I believe is her name, the blues R&B. No, she's not blue R&B. She's like a folk artist, Judy Collins. And so I ended up, like you said, The Substitute. I ended up doing commercials for a jewelry store, and a lot of that stuff is on my website as well, or on my YouTube channel as well. So I was, doing Touched by an Angel. That was part of Touched by an Angel was filmed in Utah. And so because McCarty was such an integral part of the casting of Touched by an Angel, that's how I got 2 places in Touched by an Angel, is because, they were there for so long that I could go back and do another episode of, Touched by an Angel. That's how I got the job with The Substitute. That's how I got the job in A Town Has Turned to Dust. And I ended up doing a Marlboro commercial in Europe. And, so I ended up being really lucky and doing a lot of, those kinds of things as well. So yeah, that all stemmed from Takedown, and that all stemmed from knowing this incredible casting agency called McCarty in Salt Lake.
And one thing I have to ask you, Max, because obviously, you had a great career in professional wrestling, Japan, Germany, WCW, WWF, and then on to acting as well, a music career. You are truly a jack of all trades within the entertainment industry. But aside from the new movie that you are working on, the documentary where you filmed in the World Wrestling Federation back in '95, what is next for yourself, man? Is there anything you're currently working on that you still want to touch on, talk about, or promote? But we still got you here live on the radio tonight.
I do. I'm trying my ass off to reinvigorate myself because I actually have more than one movie idea. There's a novel that I'm working on that I've been trying to write for 40 years, and I'm bound and determined to get this movie out. Right now, I'm going to devote my time to finishing this music so that the guy that's going to finish the movie can get this movie out. I really want people. I really want people to hear the music I wrote for The Thing That Should Not Be. I wrote this music. It's so funny because I wrote this music before I actually shot the movie because I knew I was going to shoot a movie one day, and I wanted to write the soundtrack for it. And so I part of the reason I wrote this album was to provide the soundtrack for my own movies. And so that's the part of The Thing That Should Not Be when it finally does come out is you will get to see what I was capable of because the music in it is my own. The video is my own. It's all from ideas I had 33 years ago, finally. And, then the world, like I said, I'll let the world decide. If the world decides I'm a piece of shit and that I wasn't talented and I had no business doing this, well, then I'll let that part of it go. And that doesn't mean I'm going to stop trying to finish what I have now. I have multiple novel ideas right now. Two of them I'm very proud. Actually, three of them I'm very proud of that I really, really want to do and get finished. I have a fiction version of a wrestling movie that if I could find the right people to jump behind me financially, I could write it tomorrow. I have the script for a motion picture that I wrote years and years ago, and I'd love to pursue that. And like I said, I've got two fiction novels that have nothing to do with the wrestling business that I'd really like to write. And then on top of that, I'm in negotiations right now with a couple people to help me write my book because, like we talked about, there's nobody else that can tell the story about the Japanese dojo other than me. And so I would really, really I'd love to go back to Japan and share my dojo stories with the Japanese as well as America, because it's an incredibly interesting time. What I went through, the feelings and the pressures and the drama I went through in the wrestling business when I was in Japan. It's a story in and of itself. My national championship season at North Idaho College, the people I was involved with, and the school, the storybook finish of my final season in the National Junior College rankings is a story unto itself as well. So hopefully, maybe I can really bust my ass and get some of these stories done and finished before I check off this planet. So that's my goal.
Well, I gotta say I definitely can tell you have a lot of time left before you check off the planet. I really think these stories can be told, and I think they will be told through the eyes and voice and memory of the iconic Maxx Payne. Before we actually part ways here tonight, man, how do we go about following yourself all across social media? That way we can stay updated on everything you currently got going on because you got some amazing projects currently in the works. And I want to make sure when this documentary drops, people get to see it on day one.
DJ, I wish I was better at, you would think a guy who is as prolific as I am verbally would be more prolific in social media. I struggle with social media a lot. I need to be more prolific. Obviously, you can find me on Facebook. Maxx Payne 61 is, I believe, my username for Facebook, but you can just type in Daryl Peterson. I I do have a Maxx Payne Facebook account. I also have uh, Payne Lair and Facebook, but none of them are up to date right now. All of them will be up to date eventually. But if you really want to get a hold of me, just go to Daryl Peterson at Facebook, and you can figure out if you're good at Facebook. Most people don't have. I think that's how you found me, is
It is,
through
yeah.
my Facebook. I do try really hard to stay up to date with my Facebook page now, because I don't want to leave people behind, because the fans I do have are so incredible and important to me. I would hope that they stay with me, and that's probably the best way that will continue to grow. I also, believe it or not, I've got this invention that I'm working on that will be coming out, I hope, in the very near future. I've invented this guitar oil and lubrication that I invented 30 years ago, and I finally got sort of the demos ready to go, and all of which I'm in the process of working on right now. So I hope over the next 6 months there'll be, more and more ways to track me down that way, DJ. But the best way is absolutely Daryl Peterson at Facebook, and I believe it's Maxx Payne 61 at Facebook. You can track me down. Also, too, is there? I have a YouTube channel. It's still there. I haven't posted on it in a while. I'm going to start again very soon. It is called The Payne Lair, all one word, PAYNELAIR. And I believe you can contact me through that as well. I believe that it will send me emails if you contact me through that. So that, I think those are the best ways that I can give you right now to get a hold of me and
And
stay in.
I was going to say first and foremost there, Max. I want to say this, man, because you had such an amazing career. In my opinion, you had the opportunity to wrestle people like Chris Benoit. You had the opportunity to wrestle Brooklyn Brawler, Cactus Jack. So many people you had the opportunity to work with. And I just want to say thank you so much for your contribution to wrestling, man. I mean, you made such a significant impact in so many people's lives, especially on our television screen, man. So thank you so much for doing what you did and went through all the trials and tribulations for your entire career, just for fans like myself to be able to watch and enjoy. So I can think I can speak on behalf of all of us fans. Thank you so much for everything you've done for professional wrestling, man. You are honestly one of the best, and I'm glad that they actually made these matches available that we can actually go back to and watch on YouTube, and of course Peacock in the States and Netflix here in Canada.
DJ, it's been such a pleasure, man. And honestly, brother, you stay in touch with me. Like I said, I hope this movie has the kind of impact I'm hoping it has. I hope fans are just really, it's one of those things that I hope it has the impact that I hoped it would have then, now. So we'll see if it does. And after you've watched it and you get a chance to check it out, I'd like to believe you're going to have at least a couple more questions for me. So don't hesitate a second to get a hold of me. And let's continue this on the next time after the movie comes out.
Hey, I 100% agree. And I will say there's already more questions I already do have. All I have to say is Bob Backlund feud, but that's for next time.
Okay, brother.
Have a good night there, Max. And of course, a great week as well. We definitely shall stay in touch, and we'll definitely talk soon, dude.
All right, DJ. It's been a pleasure, my friend. And God bless everybody. And thank you for being my fan. I really appreciate that.
Hey, you're most certainly welcome, Max. We'll talk soon, and God bless as well, man.
Okay, take care.